I'm really excited. I think this is the third time I think I've ever been to Fairfield. And the first time I was in high school. I grew up in Pella, so not too far from here. The second time, I was 2 days into trying to walk 370 miles across the state, chasing the 1835 1st United States Dragoons up the Des Moines River, and it had poured rain on me, and my phone was fried, so I needed to come and get a phone. I was going to go to Ottumwa, and I was having lunch at a friend of mine's house who lives in the old Vernon School down by Bentonsport, and she goes, "Oh, you got to go to Fairfield," and so I ended up here. And then today, I'm very excited with you to talk about Iowa frontiers. No place on planet Earth changed as much as Iowa from the early 1800s to the present moment. From the expedition of the 1st United States Dragoons up the Des Moines River in 1835 until right now, 98% of Iowa's lands changed as eager pioneers plowed the prairies to create one of the greatest gardens on God's green earth. As conversion of land titles dispossessed Iowa's indigenous peoples and alternation of habitat displaced wildlife species, life forever changed for the people, plants, and animals in the land between two rivers. A new Iowa arose, built on the backs of beasts of burden and bent on remaking the landscape to maximize agricultural production. As bison and elk herds moved out, cattle and hogs moved in. While big bluestem and bur oak became buried in the past, a new future built on corn and beans emerged. Ditching and draining, tilling and tiling, fence rows and freight trains all helped to remake Iowa's environment. People also played a part in the production. Emigrants and immigrants took up the call of the age to go west and grow up with the country. First-generation individuals from across the Atlantic arrived, hoping to improve their lot in an ever-shifting agricultural economy. The stories of immigrants help illuminate the indigenous, military population, and environmental frontiers, opening Iowa to settlement. Immigrant communities proved pivotal by defining the fortune of a state on a mission to feed the world. The environmental transformation taking place in Iowa, implemented by agents of incredible change, defines the past, present, and future of the Hawkeye State. Anybody have been to the amazing museum you guys have? Man, I just spent some time there this afternoon with a guy that's doing, I don't know where he has the energy. You talk about me doing a lot of stuff? That guy is working. And we were going through stuff, and we got upstairs onto the third floor, and we've been going through all the new exhibits in the basement and through all the storage and talking about all this stuff. And we got up there, and all of a sudden I saw this painting is on the wall in your museum as well. And it's a printing of this painting that I've never seen. It's by a guy named Edwin Blashfield, and he painted it for the Iowa Capitol. And if you go the next time you're in Des Moines, you can't miss it. It's 34 feet wide and 16 feet tall. It's 10 individual panels, and it's called Westward. And it was commissioned specifically to create this image of Iowa that is still really enduring today. And so I go there a lot and stand there. I probably go to the Capitol as much as anybody that doesn't work there. I don't know. Whenever I'm around, it's free. You just got to go through the metal detector, and you can stand on the stairs and look at that painting until somebody knocks you over. And I love to go sit there and look at that painting. I think about how everyone's made a law in our country, in our state, in the last 150 years, when they've walked up to the legislative chambers, have walked under that painting. And in the painting, and I didn't put it on a slide specifically, but it depicts on this end, there's kind of this barren landscape on the far side, and it would be the western side of the painting. There's a bison skull, and there's some scrub brush, and it's actually intentionally dark in the painting. We see this in a lot of other paintings. There's another famous painting called American Progress that has Manifest Destiny. She's got a telegraph wire strung around her arm, and she's an angel leading trains across. And you see there's animals, because there's a herd of bison, and there's a bear looking over his shoulder, growling, and there's also native people fleeing in front of this, and they look actually terrified if you magnify and look at their faces. Our painting doesn't even have native people in it, which I think is interesting. Then we have these 4 angels leading these pioneers that by the time they get past, there's corn at the end of this painting, there's some watermelons in the foreground, and we're bringing in this kind of agricultural reality that we know exists today in Iowa. I can tell you plants going. I don't know, it seemed like not going here as much as where I live, which is backwards because I'm up in the north part of the state. I live in Mason City and teach at a small college called Waldorf University in Forest City, up almost on the Minnesota border. And I got really interested in Iowa's native past as a very young person. So I did spend a lot of my childhood in Pella. That's where I graduated from high school. But when I was very young, I lived in Forest City, and then I eventually lived in Mason City. I remember walking along the Winnebago River, which runs through the county. It actually runs almost in my backyard today. And I remember walking along the river with my grandfather, and I was very confused. We had just moved to Mason City. I couldn't have been more than 5 years old. And I remember turning to him, going, "Grandpa, why'd they name a river after a motorhome?" And I'll never forget, he turned and he looked at me, and like, besides laughing, he went like, "Well, it's not named, the motorhome's not named after the river either. It's named after a group of native people who never even really lived here." And he kind of left it at that, or asked another question. I've always been the kind of person that asks way too many questions. As I got older, I kept asking this question. And when I moved back to Forest City, I've now been at Waldorf. I just finished my 10th academic year at Waldorf. And when I first got there, I got really involved in my local historical society. And I started asking people these questions. We have incredible museums there. We have what's called Heritage Park in North Iowa. We have 68 buildings on 91 acres. We have our local FFA. They just came out last week and planted oats, and we do some working farm stuff. We also have a building called the Timberland Museum that started on this guy Arlo Johnson's farm. And in the Timberland Museum are 5,000 arrowheads and other indigenous artifacts that Arlo Johnson found on his farm. Not even like collecting other places, just his farm. And so the natural question that came to mind is, where'd these all come from? And they're like, "Well, Arlo Johnson's farm." And I'm like, "No, like what people?" And they're like, "Well, native people never really lived here. They were just passing through." And I went like, "That doesn't make any sense to me. That's a lot of stuff to drop if you're just passing through." And then I kept asking the question. I started looking, and I couldn't get any really good answers. And so when I first got to Waldorf, I only had my master's degree, and they told me, "It's great that you teach these couple of classes for us, but if you want an actual job, you're going to have to get a PhD." And I was like, mission accepted, I guess. So for 3 years, I taught at 7:30 and 8:30 every day, and then I drove the 110 miles one way to Ames and did my PhD. When I got there, they told me I could get obsessed about anything I wanted in history, and I'm a homer, so I was going to do Iowa history for sure. And I started looking around, and this question kept popping into my mind, like, well, who was here and what can we possibly know about them? And I started to hear these echoes of these stories people were telling me of, well, people, they didn't really live here. Or one of the other things people in North Iowa would say is like, these were just hunting grounds. Or down here, I'll hear from people where they'll go like, well, the Sauk and Meskwaki lived here, but they were just kind of like moving through as they got pushed out of their ancestral homelands in the Great Lakes region. Or the Iowa Bahoe, they lived here, but we're not really sure exactly in what numbers or at what times, and it's impossible to know, and nobody could possibly know, and that's at least partially true. We can use the artifact record to see some of that. We can use the oral histories and listen to the peoples themselves. We can learn some different things. And I just got obsessed with kind of this frontier era and hearing the echoes of the past and trying to kind of figure out what these frontiers look like as they move across Iowa. Because I'm not an archaeologist. Wish I was. I like to play with it though. I get invited out. John Dorshuk, who's our state archaeologist, he works up the road in Iowa City. Great dude. I'll see him in a few weeks because he always runs an archaeological field school at Iowa Lakeside Laboratory, which he has been gracious enough to have me out to teach the students about some of this stuff each summer when they arrive in Spirit Lake. And so I'll be out there 2 weeks from now. But working with him, I leave that stuff to them, and that's part of the past I can't really know. But I start to look at, what did Iowa look like before? And I think one of the things that makes this really challenging is there were borders before there were borders, right? One of the common things that we kind of we constantly undercut the legitimacy of Native American society. I think that's a thing that we have to look at. These people had incredibly well-developed lifeways, living in Iowa then, and you guys got it good down here. It's warm. I thought when I moved to North Iowa, it was gonna be the same, and it's not, it's way worse. And then I went to college in North Dakota, and trust me, it gets even way worse the further north you go. But I always think about one of my first jobs out of college, even before I went to graduate school, I got hired by the Fort Abraham Lincoln Foundation. And what Fort Abraham Lincoln is known for is that's where Custer left to go to the Battle of Little Bighorn. And that's a state park that is operated by a 501c3 nonprofit. And on one side is the Custer stuff. And I didn't want to work on that side, both because I didn't find that as interesting, and you had to show up and wear the wool military uniform and pretend like you started every conversation with, well, you just missed the general. He's gone over to Bismarck. And I was like, I'm not here for that. If people called in sick, though, I got to do it, which was rough. The other side of the park, though, is a Mandan village, and the Mandan were made famous by Lewis and Clark because they lived with the Mandan on the ways out on their journey up the Missouri and on the way back. Elizabeth Fenn recently wrote a Pulitzer Prize-winning book called Encounters at the Heart of the World about the Mandan people. And I got the great job as being a 22-year-old white guy working at the Native American village. And on my very first day, it was school tour season, which we were talking about before y'all came in. And if you work at any place like this, teachers are tired of teaching by this time of the year, and they're more than gung-ho to bring the students out to places like this one, or Fort Abraham Lincoln. And on my very first day of work, after I graduated from college, I got there and I'm standing at the bridge to the Mandan Onaslant village, and the bus pulls up with my first school group, and on the side it says, Standing Rock Reservation School. And all of a sudden, I'm the white guy giving the tour of the Indian village, which was actually a great experience. One of the things I learned from that is that there's things that people know, and history tends to draw people that know it all. And I promise you, I don't know it all even about this stuff. I've been obsessed about this for the last 5 years of my life. I constantly am trying to learn more about this. And as we talk about some of the stuff, there might be stuff you guys know about this, and I'm happy to collect it. I don't know, I tell my students all the time, it's really corny, but a candle loses nothing by lighting another candle. We all just burn brighter together. So if you have things you want to contribute to the historical knowledge, that's cool. One of the things that I think is important for us to recognize is boundaries and borders were both in existence, usually based on river systems, prior to Americanization and the treaty era and the onset of that. We had native peoples competing for space. So when I think about Iowa, we're seeing a few different things happen. We certainly have the Bahoe or the Iowa living in large numbers throughout the state along most of our principal rivers. That's where our state gets its name. And we certainly see the records all the way back to French explorers. And if we listen to the Bahoe themselves, like Lance Foster, who works just up the road at the University of Iowa, he'll tell you they were here in large numbers and had well-established villages and were an agricultural people, because it turned out soil was pretty good then too. However, they're in a weird spot in the map. So if you think about new technologies that are arriving in North America with the onset of European migration, right? We have people arriving on the east coast of the United States. We have people arriving on Hudson's Bay in Canada to capitalize on the fur trade. We have French fur traders monopolizing the Great Lakes region and coming down the Mississippi River. That's how we get Marquette and Joliet descending the Mississippi. They're allegedly the first Europeans to enter Iowa. And we know from the receipts of French traders that the fur industry boomed during that time period. But even prior to that, peoples like the Bahoe or Iowa are getting incredible pressure on them. They're caught between, there's a historian, he works at Stanford, so he's got to be smarter than me. His name's Richard White. And in 1991, he wrote a book called The Middle Ground. And he wrote beautifully in there. I think it's page 27, but don't quote me on that. It's on the video, though, so it will be. But he talked about, and it stuck in my head, and I had never thought about it this way, peoples like the Iowa are caught between a hammer and an anvil. Because peoples to the north, like the Anishinaabe, Ojibwe, or what people commonly call the Chippewa, the Dakota, Lakota, Yanktonai, or what people commonly call the Sioux, are gaining access to guns, in particular, from traders coming off Hudson's Bay. People in the Iroquoian Confederacy are Algonquin-speaking peoples, which include the Sauk and Meskwaki, but also people like the Iroquois, and those nations in the eastern United States are gaining access to guns from the East Coast. If you got guns, and the people you're competing with for resources in an environment where it's difficult to live don't, that's a great advantage. And this is where we start to see, one of the things that casts this and makes this more difficult to understand or know definitively where these boundaries and borders were they were constantly shifting as people competed for control in the same way they're going to all the way up through at least 1857 in Iowa. And so indigenous borderlands are really interesting to me. One of the things I have on here, aside from several of these different indigenous leaders, is this map. Anybody recognize this map? This is the No Heart of Fear map. I won't even butcher the actual name. This is a map that was presented to the United States government in 1838, 8 years after the Indian Removal Act is passed, and it's brought by two Sauk Meskwaki leaders to DC to go, here's where we live, please respect the boundaries. And they drew this meticulous map of Iowa, and we'll see a couple of others as we move through. But this is pretty good. It's drawn from memory at a time before anybody had ever seen a map. We've all seen lots of maps. If I wanted to roll up the screen, and I thought about doing it, but I don't want to keep us here till midnight, we could try. This is what I make my students do when we talk about this in class, because I can draw a pretty mean Iowa map. My Iowa geography skills are sick. I can't do it quite to the level of this map, and I've seen a lot of maps. And part of it's like, I can get every turn in the Des Moines River because I walked all the way up it once. The detail that goes into this map, and if you overlay it, and you can go, there's a wonderful, in one of the actual state archaeological, one of their publications, they printed this side by side. It's also on the Notes on Iowa website somewhere. I don't know, if you search No Heart of Fear, it'll come up. You can go and find it and see this side by side, and it overlays like really, really well. In some ways, like I started to look at it closely with a magnifying glass because I'm strange. And I was looking for like these things and I was like, well, it's not quite. And then I looked at it and went like, oh, but we've re-engineered like all of these hundreds of miles, 3,000 miles of rivers between ditch and grading and tile that have been straightened out in Iowa. One of my good friends, Kristen Gredeman, she's writing a PhD dissertation at Iowa State right now, or another, my friend Joe Otto, who works for the government now, but he got his PhD and he wrote a wonderful dissertation called Plumbing the Prairies that talks about drain tiling in Iowa in a very exciting way, trust me. I know it sounds boring, it's awesome. But he wrote about the Skunk River, which isn't far from here, and we've been kicking around the idea that we're fairly confident you can put a canoe in what were the headwaters of the Skunk River, which have now been tiled out. They're on Kristen's family's land, and she's writing about the Prairie Pothole region in her dissertation. And for 100 miles, you can go down the Skunk River and not be in a natural foot of that river that hasn't been straightened or manipulated in a different way as it winds its way through the first 100 miles. Now, by the time we get down here, terrain's too rugged. The broader point I'm trying to make is there were borders that existed. They were changing over time. We certainly know by the time we start to see consistent records from the French in particular, which are our first Western records, or we listen to the tribes themselves, I'm obsessed with Spirit Lake because that's what I had to be, and we'll eventually get to that piece of the story. But we can debate this back and forth, but I always come down to Okoboji is a Dakota word. It's not a mistake that the Little Sioux River is called the Little Sioux River. Actually, William Williams, who's going to be the first settler at Fort Dodge, above the forks of the Des Moines, he calls it the River of the Sioux because of the incredible numbers of Dakota people living on the upper Des Moines River prior to the arrival of Americans at Fort Dodge in the 1850s. And now, I don't know what that looks like before that. I also don't know, what happened with the collapse of the Mississippian civilizations prior to that. But I do know that there are 12 Siouan-based languages that are derivative, that are spoken today in the same way that, we speak a Romance-based language, right? We're in this kind of language family. When I was in high school, I was trying to meet girls, so I decided to take French and Spanish at the same time, which is a really bad idea. They share common Latin roots. They're not the same languages. You'll just get really confused really fast. And in the same way that the Bahoe Iowa, they speak a Siouan-based language. The Ho-Chunk Winnebago speak a Siouan-based language. The Dakota Sioux speak a Siouan-based language. All of these peoples share a common language group, which tells me that at some point in the distant past in the history that we don't have access to currently, there's some commonality there that then branched off into what's going on now. And I can't know the answer to that because I don't have a time machine yet, even though I pretend to on the internet. There's something there. So as we start to see these borders changing, we also see Americans arrive on the scene. And this is what's going to bring us into this kind of competing claims era. And we have a couple of guys here that they're going to show up at Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin in 1825 for what this guy, oh, the laser pointer doesn't actually work. William Clark is going to refer to in his papers as the great drawing of boundaries. We need to divide up the land claims between these different people. And if I did have a time machine, I'd be going to Prairie du Chien in 1825. It was Cary Trask wrote about it beautifully in his book, Blackhawk and the Battle for the Heart of America. He writes this scene where all of these peoples had been called to Prairie du Chien, to what was called Fort Crawford, which if you ever go to Prairie, it's down, you go to Stark's, which is a gun store, liquor store, and in Wisconsin they think that's a good idea. And you go down onto what they call the island in Prairie du Chien, and the fort was there. And they called all of these indigenous peoples from the upper Midwest to Prairie du Chien and said, we're going to make a map. We're going to draw boundaries between these peoples. And so they showed up in force. Like Blackhawk in particular and the Sauk showed up in these elaborately decorated canoes, banging drums, and they said they came, like the people that were there, the American observers, like William Cass, who's this guy, are going to be like, they could hear the drums long before Blackhawk turns the corner. And Blackhawk was coming to negotiate from a position of power. Like, you think about early American inroads into Iowa, and we could talk about, like, if you go over to Fort Madison, they found their fort finally, archaeology again. But in the earliest era of kind of American control here, the United States wasn't able to project power that the indigenous peoples cared about. Like in the War of 1812, the Sauk and Meskwaki shut down the Mississippi River. They sent 3 expeditions north, one of them led by William Clark, another one led by Zachary Taylor, who eventually became president of the United States. And they got shut down at the Quad Cities because 5,000 indigenous warriors closed the river. They couldn't retake the fort that the British had taken at Prairie du Chien. And so when Blackhawk arrives in 1825 at Prairie du Chien for this, he goes, well, we're going to get the best piece. We've projected the power here. We're not afraid of the Americans. Prairie du Chien goes fine, I guess. Most of the people showed up, which was good. Problems immediately followed. So in my research, I talk about a lot about a guy named Inkpaduta. Do you guys know who Inkpaduta was? He was a Wapakute Dakota leader, what most people would call Sioux. He attacked Spirit Lake and the settlement there in 1857. Don't worry, we'll get there. And him and his band killed virtually every American living in the Iowa Great Lakes region and then left the state. That was a spoiler for later in the talk. His father, though, and another leader, their names were Tisagi and Wamdasapa, they're going to be at Prairie du Chien in 1825. They go, and immediately the Sauk and Meskwaki start raiding against the Dakota throughout the border between those tribes that existed before. Tisagi's wife, in fact, he's going to be out hunting. Sauk Meskwaki war party is going to come into their village. They're going to attack, and by the time he gets back, his wife has not only been killed, but her head's been chopped off and her body's been thrown in the river. He fished her head out of the river and brought it to Fort Snelling, Camp Coldwater in Minnesota, which was the American fort in 1826. Lawrence Telefier is going to be running the fort at the time, and he's going to, we could go into the exact quotes, but to paraphrase, he's going to say, like, I can't project power outside of the walls of the fort. What do you expect me to do about something that's happening on the Shell Rock River in North Iowa? I don't have the power to do this. And so even though we start to see this treaty era taking place, we do see most of the important leaders that actually have the power at Prairie du Chien in 1825. I can tell you, Tisagi and Wamdasapa, after this instance in 1826, they just reject American power outright. The bands that eventually attack Spirit Lake don't attend another treaty proceeding all the way through 1857. They said, we've seen what your treaties do, and they're not effective, and you don't have the power to enforce them. So we're not going to abide by them. We're the actual powerful people here. I think there's something to this with Blackhawk as well. So like, we're in the heart, like we could all like just hop in the car, so we should just go down and do the next part at Iowaville Cemetery, right? We could gather around, it'd be interesting. Blackhawk, though, is going to be such an important military leader, and he continually pushes back against American control. I think one of the things that we see with Blackhawk is he constantly advocates a position leading up to what people call the Blackhawk War in 1832 of resistance to Americanization. First, he doesn't want to abandon their village at Socanock on the Mississippi River. And they narrowly avert disaster the year before the Blackhawk War when Blackhawk returns with his band, 5,000 people or so, including men, women, and children. They occupy, there's a very tense moment where the territorial militia is called out from Illinois. A young guy who most of us have probably heard of, his name was Abraham Lincoln, shows up with the militia. But they broker a deal, and Blackhawk eventually leaves, recrosses the river in the moments before we see any conflict erupt. These people living in Illinois that came out as militia and not Abraham Lincoln, at least I don't know that, so I'm not going to implicate him in this. They go and were like spoiling for a fight, and they dig up the giant graveyard at Socanock and desecrate a bunch of the corpses, which didn't play well with the Sauk and Meskwaki when they heard about it. The following year, Blackhawk again returns, and he decides he's going to really challenge American power. He sent messengers up to the British to see if they're going to support him. He's at least gotten some tacit support that says, we'll give them guns, we could provide you with some other support. And what he's actually hoping to do is something we see play out across the continent time and again. We could go all the way back to Virginia and look at like Powhatan's Confederacy and them rising up in what people call the Virginia Massacre in the 1600s. Or you could talk about King Philip's War, Metacom's Rebellion, as that takes place in New England. We see the same kind of pattern playing out time and time again, and that's where like frontiers get some uniformity and can start moving. Because I think like we have these indigenous borderlands. So we have frontiers that already exist, right? Different groups of people pushing for control of land and natural resources. Then we start to see like people who don't have control trying to draw lines on maps so we can then move towards some kind of control. And this is kind of an era of military frontiers. So you guys knew, well, maybe you didn't know because you don't know anything about me. I was going to talk about the Dragoons. I was obsessed with the Dragoons from when I was a little kid. You know, I saw the signs. You guys drive south. Well, actually, for some reason, they don't extend the Dragoon Trail to Montrose. We should like really fix that. We could just like add it to the guy at the museum's list of things to do. Be like, hey, you know, we'll get the folks in Van Buren County to do it, you know? I don't know. They seem to be doing tourism. But the Dragoons are going to march from Montrose, and one of the things that drew me to them is that in 1835, Stephen Kearny is going to be leading this group of 3 companies up the Des Moines River on a massive expedition to explore Iowa. They're going to be there to show the indigenous populations a military presence. They're there to record notes about the natural resources that are there. And then they're also going to just gather any other relevant intelligence. Kearny is not somebody that was like big on taking or writing like really eloquent long notes. Like if you go and read his journal, it's like, woke up today. No, it's almost always one line, especially after the 1820 expedition. You could tell like he got less gung-ho about expeditions after he went on the Yellowstone expedition way back in the 1820s. They looked at this as like, we don't want to stay in Montrose. Like they had arrived at First Fort Des Moines on the Mississippi, and it wasn't completed in the way they thought it was going to be. It was never meant to be a permanent post. It was a miserable winter there, and the men were getting restless, and he was very excited to get out and go on campaign, as he was calling it. He also ended up with somebody who did like to write more and had some broad visions for what he was trying to do, a guy named Albert Miller Lee, who the following year is going to write a book that some people will claim, like the State Historical Society did when they reprinted it, gave Iowa its name, Iowa excluded. But Albert Lee's going to write a book called Notes on the Wisconsin Territory, particularly pertaining to the Iowa District. And that's the first time we see in Western sources Iowa really showing up in print. Now, I also ripped it off to create Notes on Iowa because I was like, ooh, Notes on Wisconsin Territory, I can do this. And then when I get done doing the Dragoons, I didn't call this like, I followed the Dragoons. So then I can like make other stuff, which I've continued to do, but we'll talk about that at the end. So they set out, and one of the things that they did was create a really interesting record of what Iowa looks like at this moment. In 1835, they go up the Des Moines River. Albert Miller Lee writes this book. They create, there's several other journals. Many of the dragoons saw good lands and end up settling on military service land claim grants throughout the state, which is also a part of this military frontier. This is a thing I had never really thought about. But for like a very long time in America's history, one of the things that we did was if you served in the Revolutionary War, or you served in the War of 1812, or you were in one of these other ad hoc military groups like the Dragoons, when you finished your service, we gave you a homestead on the frontier. And then the people that were living on the frontier had military training. They were able to form a militia. They're pretty good with guns. And they were able to move out to this area where it's like the fear on the frontier was incredibly real. Like, they're not exaggerating that in Little House on the Prairie. Like, I was recently reading that with my niece, and because I'm trying to brainwash her into being interested in all the things I'm interested in, so we've been reading Little House. You know, I bought her the set. It's yellow. It was around in the 1970s. I had to get that one because I didn't trust the new one. But we went through and we were reading it, and it's like you can really get the sense from Laura Ingalls Wilder, and this is very true if you read letters, if you read other documents, if you go back and spend a bunch of time looking at the frontier during this time period, people were afraid of what they didn't know, and rightfully so. They're extending and pushing this boundary, and until there's some kind of strength in numbers, this military frontier moves through, you're really kind of on the edge. We can see this. A lot of times we talk about Indian removal as 1830 Legislative Act, the only major piece of legislation that passes during the Jackson administration. And we talk about it a lot of times, in K through 12 education in particular, as the 5 civilized tribes. We talk about Worcester versus Georgia and the Supreme Court cases and moving the Cherokee out of Georgia and the Trail of Tears and all these things, which like are very important and rightfully so. But people don't like get, I don't know, do people read legislation? Do people read it now? Did they read it then? I don't know. But one of the other things, if you go back and you read the Indian Removal Act in 1830, one of the other things it did was create a line of military forts from Fort Snelling to Arkansas. And then as the population advanced, so did this military frontier. So you'd make a treaty, you'd build a fort. Then when you had built in enough population, because people will live where they feel safe. I think that's still something that exists today that we can understand. So like we see this in the string of Fort Des Moines, right? We see first Fort Des Moines at Montrose here. Then we're going to see they temporarily move up to Fort Sanford, which is at Garrison Rock. If you're in Ottumwa, if you climb up on there, there's a pioneer cemetery, but on the Big U, the fort was up there as well. That had been a former French trading post that the Dragoons occupied under Captain James Allen for 1 year. And then they eventually moved up to Fort Des Moines number 2, which was at the confluence. They actually just had this open. They were doing street work in Des Moines, and I got a call from one of my friends at the DOT. He's like, hey, you better get to Des Moines today. They're going to dig up old Fort Des Moines. I was like, do you know that? And he's like, no, but if they do find it, don't you want to be there? And I was like, yeah, you're right. I don't know. What are you going to find under downtown Des Moines when you're breaking stuff up? The funniest thing to me about Des Moines is one of the things that they were looking for when the Dragoons went across Iowa in 1835 were future fort sites. And they got to the confluence of the Raccoon River and the Des Moines River where Second Fort Des Moines was, and Carnegie was not impressed. If you look in his journal, he's like, you should not build a military fort there. They eventually did, and then it flooded catastrophically in 1851, and I don't know, it must have worked out because the capital's still there. But certainly a place. And as they move this kind of frontier across the state, and we could see this where it's like we have our Mississippi River era forts. After we see these early treaties, we and decide to slide the Ho-Chunk Winnebago into what we're calling the neutral ground between the Sauk and Meskwaki at 1830, which wild. We'll look at that on the next slide briefly. They were like, we're having a lot of trouble mitigating this frontier between these two indigenous peoples that are clearly not getting along. They speak different languages, and they've been competing for land and natural resources. We have this other group who just was successfully subdued under military force in Wisconsin. I guess we'll just move them between those other two peoples that also don't like them. Pretty rough. We'll get back to how that went for them eventually, but they move into Fort Atkinson. We do see some of these. This is more complex because we have some of these other forts and the timing isn't on this map, and I also didn't create it. I stole it from the state archaeologist's office. But As we're moving this across, we go Fort Sanford, Fort Des Moines. When they decommission Fort Des Moines, those troops are moved up the river to Fort Dodge, and that's where William Williams becomes the sutler of the fort there. And this is where we can see this playing out. And as this is what people usually talk about as the frontier traditionally in historical study. So there's a guy named Frederick Jackson Turner. You guys ever heard of Frederick Jackson Turner? Okay. Again, back to the time machine. If I had a time machine, I'd really go to the Chicago World's Fair. You guys know about that? It was awesome. They had electric lights. It's cool. Also Cracker Jacks for the first time, and Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, where they had Native Americans who fought against cavalry troops at the Little Bighorn, reenacting the Battle of Little Bighorn. What? Had to just be crazy. And among all of these incredible achievements, Nikola Tesla, electrocuting stuff, and all of these incredible, they captured whole villages of people. I mean, it was a different time, and brought them to Chicago to go on display in what they called an international village, which was a forerunner to the It's a Small World ride at Disney World. Walt Disney's dad helped build the Chicago World's Fair. It's one of the things that gave Walt Disney the idea that he could be like, oh, you could just build a fake thing and people would come pay a nickel? It'd be great. Anyway. Turner gave a crazy speech. I mean, it wasn't that crazy. If you go back and read the accounts of it, people were falling asleep, like many of you are about to in about 15 minutes. In it, it's so funny because whenever people write about it, they're in a dingy room at the Chicago World's Fair, Frederick Jackson Turner, who's one of the first ever academic historians. He's working at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He was also my doctoral advisors. So he's like my academic great-great-great-granddaddy, which is a weird thing. But we all just study the frontier, and that's kind of how academia works. You find somebody else that likes the weird you like, and then you just get real obsessed about it. But Frederick Jackson Turner is going to be at the Chicago World's Fair, and he gives a speech that eventually becomes a book called The Significance of the Frontier in American History. And he talks about that there's nothing more identity forming in the history of the United States than the frontier experience. And he talks about is there's a coarseness, an ingenuity, an incredible energy that comes with having to solve your own problems, living out on this frontier, and that this pioneer ethos and spirit is what makes America, America. He also walked this back in years afterwards. We're not here for a detailed breakdown of the Turner historiography. But his important snapshot, one of the other things he did, he declared the frontier closed. Said it's over. 1894, it was over. Because the government had been talking about the frontier. Once we got the military frontier out of the way, we moved towards a population frontier, which the government talked about as 2 people per square mile. And once you got to 2 people per square mile, you had enough people to form a militia, which is true. That's part of it. And we can see this so these maps are going to be unfamiliar to you because you live in this part of the state. But I'll give you some things. So where I live is Cerro Gordo County, right here. This is the edge. You're like, what a weird map. Why would you choose those counties? When I was doing my doctoral research, I went to every historical society and county courthouse and tried to dig up every single source of information I could possibly find. Because one of the things that I kept running into was people telling me, well, Native people, they were just passing through here. And then I would read the documents from the time period, and they'd be like, natives stopped again today at our house asking for food, which is cultural miscommunication, people asking for tribute for people they view as being on their land versus people, these native peoples keep begging us for stuff. And it's that's a whole nother thing that if you want 25 pages on it, my doctoral dissertation is available online through the Iowa State University Library. Trying to get those download numbers up, Just figure you guys need some really dense summer reading. But one of the things that I did was I tried to figure out where the Dakota, especially the Wapakute Dakota under Inkpaduta, what people commonly call the Sioux, are showing up in Iowa in the years running up to 1857. And these are all the counties where I ran into actual evidence of Inkpaduta somewhere. So I wanted to see how the frontier changed around him because I'm trying to think about what would it take for me to decide to kill everyone? Because that was a decision he eventually made. How much would your life have to change? So one of the things that is beautiful that's happening in your county is you guys are doing a great job with century farms and heritage farms. Anybody take part in that? Go to any of those? Anybody got a century farm? It's cool, right? Next one up. And I think about how all right, so I play slow pitch softball. I'm about to retire because I don't want to blow my Achilles. But on my team, there are 5 people that are on century or heritage farms. When I talk to them, we think about like, man, that's a deep past. My family doesn't have a past. We came to Iowa in 1986 when everybody was leaving because of the farm crisis. I don't know how that worked out that way. My parents decided they'd had enough of Chicago, I guess. But as like, we honor that because that's a really cool thing. That's 150 years. You think about like, but then when we look at like native peoples, like the Dakota, who were like, well, they're just passing through. They undoubtedly lived in the Spirit Lake region for at least like 200, 250 years based on the archaeological evidence. And I'm being narrow in that window. Like John Dorshuk, the stuff he's like dug up at Minnewacan and that he's working on in some of those other digs. I think when he eventually publishes his stuff that's tying pottery to Mille Lacs and some of the other sites and like basically just proving what the Dakota have been telling us all along that like, yeah, we live there in incredible numbers. Okoboji literally means place of rest in our language. Anyway, I digress. We start to see this population frontier creeping through. And this is displacing people that had been here. So it's like, all right, you guys got a century farm? One up. Heritage. Oh, so you're 150? That's a pretty good run. Yeah, we're in a weird part of the state. Nobody in my part of the state is up for that. You know, like we're not there yet. Nobody moved there until after later. I always forget when I get down here, you guys are older. You know, you guys have been here for a minute longer. And in like the historical time frame, it's like, think about like your Fairfield history documentary, you go back 45 million years. You think about like if all of human history is a clock, like your ancestors arriving on that farm 2 minutes before midnight, if we're at midnight right now. You think about like where that time is played out. And when I think about the Dakota and I started to look into this and think about it, one of the things I started to think about is as these populations come in, they're radically, like, it's not just people moving in. In Iowa, we're recreating the landscape completely. We're going to convert 98% of our landscape into agricultural production. That doesn't just mean plowing the prairies. It means like we lost most of our wildlife species in Iowa. Like we take white-tailed deer for granted today, but they were extirpated from the state by the like, I mean, maybe the 1890s, but like really after 1857 in like much decimated numbers. Elk are going to be completely destroyed in populations in the state. And in the place of these animals, we're going to see fences go up, we're going to see livestock come in, and this isn't like some indictment on the American farmer. It's a reality of what happened. You know, one way of life came in as population came. And when I think about this, like we can see it stretching out, like we're down here, right? And this is my favorite map of Iowa. It's from 1845. I like to show it to my friends from Minnesota because I live by the border, and I tell them they're all from Iowa because St. Paul was in Iowa until the year of statehood, and they get real mad. They're like, no, Iowa's awful. I'm like, you're from here, so I don't know, borders? Yeah, kind of make them, you know, they wanted to make more states, so they decided to do it. So like we're more familiar with this boundary that uses the Big Sioux and cuts over here. This is that neutral ground I was talking about right here. And then we can see the counties developing, and counties are building population, they're being platted. There's a very orderly survey process taking place in America post-1787 that's moving across the continent. As people are moving in, it's also moving native peoples further west, right? That's part of this dispossession that's taking place. And as this is happening, some of the leaders are rejecting American power outright. That's what we see with the Dakota. We see leaders like Blackhawk try to test those boundaries to disastrous ends. I don't know if you do go up to Prairie du Chien, just keep going up the road and go to Bad Axe and think about what happened to Blackhawk and his people there in the summer of 1832. Because they recrossed the river in defiance of the Americans, thinking the British were going to come to their aid and that they were going to start a people talk about it as a pan-indigenous revolution. Like different native peoples were all going to come together and overthrow American power. And Blackhawk was banking on at least that the Winnebago Ho-Chunk would come into that. He specifically went to different villages, including the last one when he got really desperate after the Battle of Wisconsin Heights. He's going to recross the Mississippi River with 5,000 men, women, and children. And he's being pursued by the state and territorial militias of Wisconsin and Illinois behind him. The American military is pushing up the river on the USS Warrior from Prairie du Chien. And then these other native peoples who also view themselves as legitimate governments on par with the United States are also allying to try to get the best deal for themselves. So the Dakota Sioux, they ally with the Americans, and they're sworn enemies of the Sauk. They're on the other bank. So these people go to cross the river. This is the USS Warrior. This is at, that's Blackhawk Point. And if you were to look at this larger painting, if you just search USS Warrior, you'll find the painting, or you could look this up. It's on the calendar. It's sometime in like August, but if you typed in Blackhawk, you'd find it. There's all these native people jumping off this raft into the river because they're just being strafed by the heavy gunfire from the USS Warrior as it's going across the river. Blackhawk is going to try to eventually, he's going to escape, be imprisoned, brought to Prairie du Chien, eventually gets taken on his tour of the eastern United States, dies on his farm, body gets stolen, goes to Burlington, either is like in that guy's basement or Aspen Grove Cemetery, or I don't know, ask Russ Fry. He's from Burlington. He'll tell you that he absolutely knows what happened to Blackhawk, which is one of those things that, I don't know. Is it knowable? Maybe. But I do trust that Russ has like really cared about that for a long time, so he's probably right. And in that wake, we do just see this environmental frontier taking place in an incredible way. All right, so like sometimes I like to just think about how much Iowa changed and how fast. Like, and I love numbers. I'm like the only history person that can do math, which is why they keep making me treasurer of stuff. Like, they're all like, numbers? So like, let's think about, so, all right, you guys, 154 years, so you got here when? 1840s. So you're like really early. So like 1840, the official population of Iowa, 43,112 people. That's at the federal census. 10 years later, by 1850, 192,000 people. That's incredible change, 345% increase over that decade. By the time we move to 1860, we're at 1.194 million people. That's incredible change, pushing this frontier further west. We can also see this like taking place, like this is where our population density of the state is going to climb incredibly over the course of this time period, 1840 to 1860. We go from 0.8 people per square surveyed mile in 1840 to 12.2 by 1860, growing fast. As we do this, we could break down all these others. We're also like doing the survey. So like in 1840, there's not enough of a survey for them to even like put it in the US Census. It just has dashes. By 1850, we do see 824,000 acres surveyed of improved lands. So it means somebody's living on them. There's your farm, right? Then we also have other lands that have been surveyed but are not necessarily improved, and we're all the way up to almost 2 million acres by 1850. They're making their way across with the survey, which these are usually survey crews working like, I don't know, 4 to 8 people, a couple of strikers, people running chains, and doing it as fast as possible because they got paid per mile. So like, they're getting it done. The survey was imperfect and readjusted consistently. But as they do that, they're also bringing in this new way of life. So like, I like to think about agriculturally, like this is, I always think about tearing the fabric. I was reading a Pioneer account recently where the guy was talking about when he was driving oxen on a heavy plow to break prairie grass, it sounded like ripping fabric as he was cutting through those dense prairie roots. And as people came, people were coming to create a new life for themselves. Many of these people coming from the eastern United States or Europe, whether it's individually or as people, trying to create a better life. I mean, like, I don't begrudge anybody creating a better life. It's also competing with other people, and that's something we got to be cognizant of. I was thinking about Roland Gardner. So there's a guy named Roland Gardner, and he's growing up in New England, and he's in a farming family, but he was not the oldest son in that farming family, which, I don't know, this was in the 1800s, so like, trust, he wasn't inheriting that farm. He got sent to work in a comb factory, which sounds crazy to me in the 1800s, like we're still like market revolutions taking place and he's just there making combs all day. I picture him like my students that drop out of college and they go work at Winnebago on motorhomes and they come back and they're like determined to be really good college students. Roland Gardner's working on his comb factory, meets a girl, they get married, they have a few kids, and eventually he decides he's going to take up what he calls the call of the age. He's going to go west. John O'Sullivan, go west and grow up with the country. And he decides to go west. He goes first to Indiana, decides it's too settled up. He's packed up his wife, his kids. He's going to eventually move into Iowa and settle initially at Clear Lake in North Iowa. His daughter eventually wrote about him, and she said that he was a wide-awake man, representative of the times, always chasing the western horizon. He's one of those people, and like I don't know, like I'm a big believe in better person. Like I think like stuff's gonna get better, and like you can do things that are going to improve your life. And like Roland Gardner certainly had some of that. He even gets to Clear Lake, and he like can't. He's late there too. So like he arrives in the early 1850s, or like mid 1850s, 1854, and something actually happens while he's there. We call it the Grindstone War, but that's like really dramatic for what actually happened. Because in 1854, we see Sarasota County starting to settle. And we do see the Dakota exercising power in that region. The Winnebago Ho-Chunk are being dispossessed and pushed west, and there's a small community of people living at Clear Lake. One of them is a trader named Joseph Hewitt. He's who wrote most of the records of this, but it's also very well documented from several other sources. And there's going to be an incredible moment of tension. These Dakotas show up and they make some demands to the settler community at Clear Lake. One of the people says no. A native guy takes a grindstone, breaks it, thus the Grindstone War, and eventually the settlers give the native peoples what they want. And one of the things that the Dakota wanted was to take their Ho-Chunk enemies in Winnebago and ship them back to Fort Atkinson. We don't want them living here. There's too many people here already. We're competing for these land and natural resources. The settlers at Clear Lake put the Winnebago Ho-Chunk into wagons and smuggle them out in the middle of the night and send them back to Fort Atkinson. The following year, however, the Dakotas show up again, and a very different interaction takes place. This population frontiers happened. I was going to make a Norris Springs joke, but you guys won't get it. Norris Springs is like a small town that was the biggest town then, but like just for that 1 year in the 1850s. And then eventually Clear Lake, Mason City became kind of the dominant towns. But when the Dakotas show up again at Clear Lake the following year and start making demands of the settler community, instead of going like, here, we'll give you what you're demanding of us, they send out riders and bring together a militia. And I don't know exactly what went through Ink Paduda's mind, because he spent the rest of his life like, I don't know, resisting the American government and eventually dying in Canada. But he must have like counted and went like, nope. And we never saw the Dakota Sioux again in Sarasota County. Now we see them in Kossuth County. They show up in Ambrose and Asa Call's records at Algona, or we obviously see them later at Spirit Lake. We see them all the way down as far as Woodbury County at what's called Smithland, just south of Sioux City, where they're going to be in the winter of 1857. And as this is happening, we can see this population frontier impacting on the Dakota. They're struggling. So more of them are taking another option, right? We have more treaties being signed. In 1851, there's the Treaty of Mendota that's going to take place in Minnesota. It's going to be signed by other Dakota leaders, giving away their final lands in Iowa. The leaders that signed that aren't the leaders that are occupying that. The American government didn't have to look far for like people that were willing to maybe like sign those deals. And as Ink Paduda continues to try to live this very traditional lifestyle, he's eventually going to test out the American system in different ways. He tries to draw annuities actually at the reservation on the Minnesota River. He's going to, when Sido-Minuduta, who is maybe not his biological kin, a lot of people talk about him as his brother, he was another leader where we talk about like Tisagi and Wamdasapa. They're the two people that inherited power within that band. We're getting kind of lost in the weeds with some of these details. Eventually, Sido-Minuduta is going to be killed by the no-good horse thief Henry Lott, and instead of Ink Paduda like pursuing justice with like the Dakota and a bunch of warriors, instead they're going to take it to the American court system where there's going to be a sham trial and then eventually like no justice for Ink Paduda. We can see him like testing out this new system. We can also see him trying to exert this power, and this is where like we end up at kind of this last gasp of the frontier. So winter of 1856-57 is the worst winter we've ever had, maybe. I don't know, I did all the tree ring data. That's not the greatest indicator. We can also know from records, people always complain about winter, but this one is real bad. We saw huge losses of wildlife populations as well. One of the problems that we were seeing is like both overhunting from desperate settlers that were overextended on the frontier at places like Spirit Lake, but then also just the consistent, like large, heavy snowstorms followed by deep temperature plunges decimated Iowa's wildlife populations in incredible ways. James J. Dinsmore, man, if you guys haven't ever checked out his book, A Country So Full of Game, change your life. Him and his son just came out with a new book called Iowa's Changing Wildlife, which takes from the end of Country So Full of Game to now, and still James Dinsmore writing cool stuff about wildlife in Iowa. It's great. But anyway, he wrote about that extensively. Winter of 1856-57 is awful, and also the Dakota are struggling. Inkpaduta has taken his people to where they've spent the winters for at least as far back as American records go in Woodbury County at a place called Smithland. Smithland is just south of modern-day Sioux City-ish. It's right by Ottawa, if you guys know where that is. Preparation Canyon State Park, you're in the neighborhood. You can find it even if you're lost. That's how I ended up there the most recent time. That's where I took that picture. It was sunset. I started crying. I'd been giving a talk like this, and I ended up at this marker on accident, which is one of the most significant sites in my entire life. And you know, like when, I don't know, you guys, Shoeless Joe, W.P. Kinsella, book that's Field of Dreams is based on, he talks in there about all the cosmic tumblers clicking into place. It's one of those moments. Then you got to cry, you know? My grandma would call it a God thing. You go in, and they're at Smithland, and tension builds from the fall when Inkpaduta arrives. So the Dakota, they show up at Smithland where they've lived. The guy whose land they had been living on, which they had been living on prior to that guy claiming that land, he had sold out to somebody else and moved to Sioux City. We'd seen a whole group, a large migrant group coming from the eastern United States, also settling right there at Smithland. As they settled there, it created all sorts of tension. Both you have these native peoples who think these people are on their land. You have these people that have moved in and paid the land office and have their rightful claims and papers. And then you also have this environmental event that's going to tax all the local animal populations. Also, they had a massive prairie fire right before winter, which burned off all of their feed for their cattle over the course of the winter, and eventually their cattle started dying of starvation. We see several other small incidents build up over the course of the early winter at Smithland. We see the Dakotas shoot an elk and then it's scared off by one of the settlers, or there's an incident where somebody kicked somebody's dog, or so the Dakota are digging up a cache pit of agricultural crops that they probably buried themselves, but people are like, you stole our corn. There's all sorts of back and forth between these people, and the tension keeps building and building until February of 1857. We're in the worst winter we've ever seen. And the settlers of Smithland decide, we've had enough. And they call together a local militia, and they confront Inkpaduta and the Dakota living at Smithland. They say, you have to leave. And they thought, and part of this is probably ethnocentricity, but I know that they thought this. I've read the letters of these people. The great-granddaughter of the person that did this is a really good friend of mine who I've met through research, because history can connect people, and that's beautiful. But they were like, well, these native people would just go into Nebraska and live with the other native people, not paying attention, nah, it wasn't going to happen based on tribal differences and ethnicity and those kind of things. So what the Dakota actually do is they give up their guns in the worst winter, maybe in Iowa's history, and they start fleeing up the Little Sioux River towards Okoboji, place of their summer villages, the origination of corn agriculture in the Dakota people's oral history. Literally Okoboji, place of rest in the Dakota language. And as they go up the river, it's kind of interesting because they don't kill anybody. They do break into some houses, steal some guns, steal some food. They have interactions with settlers that don't result in people getting killed until they arrive in the Iowa Great Lakes region. And something hits a tipping point where it's I don't know you. You go home after this, somebody's making a sandwich in your kitchen. I don't know how hungry you are right now either. But I do know that as Inkpaduta was fleeing up the Little Sioux River, one of his grandchildren starved to death. These are desperate, desperate people on their last gasp. And when they arrive in the Iowa Great Lakes, since when they left, people have moved in. There's also some I don't know, there's a lot of he said, she said, and a lot of imperfect historical stuff here. Abby Gardner-Sharp wrote the most enduring record of this. It's called The Spirit Lake Massacre by Abby Gardner-Sharp. She was 14 years old, and her family was killed. I mean, her infant brother was killed by being smashed against a tree. She was more than likely raped. She was captured by the Dakota, watched her entire family killed, and then she came back, and 60 years later, she wrote about what happened to her. And like, I hope none of us ever have to live through anything like that, and I don't anticipate we will. And I have incredible empathy for her. I also realize, like, I don't remember, like, if I try to write about stuff that happened to me 10 years ago, it's all distorted, let alone 50, 60 years and things that were that tragic. And if you read that book, you can see that she has her own perspective, and she dedicated her life to preserving the memory of this event. I mean, the cabin's still there. It's owned by the State Historical Society of Iowa. You can go look at it. There's stuff still in there. You can go, and she wrote a book about this. She petitioned the legislature to build a monument to the expedition that came from Fort Dodge to bury the bodies. Like, she spent her whole life telling this story, but telling it in that way, where that's how we talk about it. And I think about it as like, and I'm not here to tell you like, it's right to kill 36 people. I am here to tell you though, like the Dakota, I think, as they were moving through this, were pushed by these frontiers, right? We went from this indigenous frontier to then we have this governmental frontier, which they ended up rejecting. Population frontier follows anyway. And it's not, we don't see violence until we get to this environmental frontier, because all of us, it comes down to the end of the day, like we're all just depending on 4 inches of topsoil to like keep our civilization running. And as these people got more and more desperate, we see this reaching this violent tipping point. Afterwards, they do abduct Abby and 3 other women, 2 of which that don't eventually make it. And the governor of Minnesota Territory eventually ransoms back Abby and the other woman. And Abby dedicates her life to telling a story. Inkpaduta is interesting after Spirit Lake because he evades American justice. He goes west, and he actually has a huge falling out with his sons immediately after Spirit Lake because his sons don't get it. They go, we won. Let's go back. And he basically tells them, we can't go back. And they end up joining up with the Yanktonai, and they become like fierce parts of the resistance to Americanization on the upper Great Plains across the 1860s and 1870s. Inkpaduta is at the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876. He's probably not fighting because nobody knows when he was born, but he had to be like very, very old for the 1800s. But he was undoubtedly there because he arrives after that battle. Again, he ends up moving further to avoid American justice and this Americanization. He's moving out of the way of this frontier. He ends up dying in Canada, where he fled with Sitting Bull after the Battle of Little Bighorn, and that's where his story eventually ends. From indigenous frontiers rooted in the distant past to a modern agricultural moment where unparalleled efficiency in agriculture creates new challenges, immigrants play pivotal parts in the transformation. Immigrant missionaries, fur traders, dragoons, railway workers, farmers, millers, miners, merchants, factory laborers, and meat packers all acted to influence environmental change. The 98% shift in Iowa's environment represents the most significant change on planet Earth from the early 1800s to the place we find ourselves in now. The environmental transformation taking place in Iowa, implemented by these agents of incredible change, defines the past, present, and future of our state. Through examining these contributions and frontiers and the historical arc of change in Iowa, we can hope to better understand who we've been, who we are, and who we might still hope to be. Thank you guys for listening.